And what was fascinating, one of the very first cases that I worked on was a fellow, and he was down in Texas, in a small country, little town in Texas. Most of the spy cases, by the way, did not occur in the big cities. Most of them were out around the country in smaller towns. And this was a small town in Texas.
Oh, welcome to Ham Radio Perspectives. I'm Tom, WA9TDD, and...
Yeah, and I'm Quin still, K8QS here in Michigan. And boy, have we got a terrific video for you today. I ran across Jim K1ACT, I think it was on 17 meters. And I made a note to get back to him sometime because his story was so fascinating. And there you see Jim sitting there at his place in Maine, and you see the FBI seal behind him, because we're going to be talking about the FBI and the CIA. In fact, the topic is a ham in the FBI and the CIA. And the ham, of course, is Jim K1ACT. But Jim, everybody wants to know, when we have guests on the channel, how the guests first got involved in ham radio. So what do you have to say about that one?
Well, it was a long time ago. Believe it or not, this is my 70th year of being an active ham radio operator. I was licensed in October of 1956, thanks to a neighbor who was a shortwave listener, who had a piece of furniture in his living room that had a little radio inside, and he used to listen to Radio Moscow. And so I'd go over and listen to Radio Moscow with him, and all of a sudden I realized this shortwave listening was kind of a fun hobby. At the same time, I had another friend whose father was a ham, and his call, of all calls, was W1WAS. And his name was Vince Carr. He lived about a half a mile from me, and he had a tower out behind his house, and it probably was a good 75 feet in the air, with about 3 stacked 6-meter beams on top. And he had been a ham for years, and he spent all of his time dealing with 6 meters and 2 meters. And he worked the world on those particular bands. Now, this is going back to the 1950s. In those days, propagation was so good that you could use a coat hanger and work the world. So as a result of my neighbors and my own interest in just how in the world they make contact with other people around the world, I couldn't wait to get involved. And so within a year of my turning 14 years of age, my mother took me down to the FCC licensing facility in Portland, Maine, and I took my novice exam and got the call KN1ACT. And that was in September of 1956. And in October, I was issued my license. Now, in those days, you had several different classes of license. You had novice, then you had the technician class, which a lot of people were going to because they couldn't pass the 13 words a minute code speed test. The general class license, a conditional class license, and then later on the advanced license, and then the extra class license. And so at that time, back in the 50s, I went ahead and got my novice license, and then I got my conditional license, which was the equivalent of a general, except it was conditional because somebody came to my house, a qualified, certified a ham radio operator could give you the test in your house. And so I took the test, which gave you all of the general, all of the perks of having a general license. So my license was changed from KN1ACT to K1ACT. Later on, I went ahead and got my general, and then later on, years later, I went ahead and got my advanced. And at that time, advanced was all I needed, and I've stayed in advanced for all of these 70 years. And I might mention that ham radio has been a very important part of my life, because I'm now living in the 39th house in 60 years that I've lived in. And I've had a ham radio station in every one of them.
There's a story. Boy, oh boy, if you had pictures of all those stations, that would be quite something.
And Jim, how did you end up working for the FBI? Do you have a background in accounting?
No, that's one of the reasons why I was interested in meeting up with you guys today to talk a little bit about how to become an FBI agent. I was a high school science teacher. I was teaching biology and earth science at my old high school. And at that time, my uncle happened to be the deputy police chief in town. And he attended the FBI Academy down in Quantico, which was a special 3-month school that, that mid managers and senior managers in law enforcement could attend at the FBI Academy. In those days, it was in Washington, D.C. The thing that was unique about it was these were all future leaders in law enforcement from around the world, all expenses paid by the FBI to bring them to Washington. And they had college level accredited courses for 3 months. My uncle had waited almost 5 years to get accepted into the program. So when he finally got in and was about to graduate, of course, my aunt was very excited, but she was afraid to fly. So she asked me to take some time off from school and to drive her down to Washington, D.C., so I could attend his graduation exercise with her. So I took a few days off from school, drove my aunt down to Washington. And in those days, the students lived in B&B scattered around the District of Columbia and an old boarding house. So I was spending the night or the few days in a boarding house in Washington with my aunt, and it was the same place where my uncle was living. The first night we were there, I go downstairs to watch TV. I didn't want to go to bed early. So there's a football game on. So I went down to the rec room in the bottom floor of this boarding house, and I go into this dark, dingy room, and there's a guy sitting over in the corner sipping whiskey and chewing on a cigar. And I come walking into the room, and he looks around at me and he says, "Hey, kid, you want a cigar?" Well, I never had a cigar in my life. I was 24 years old. And then he holds up a little glass of wine and says, "How about a glass of whiskey?" Well, because my ego kicks in. I'm a kid from Maine. I've never been out of the state before, and I'm not going to say no to anything. So I sit down with this guy, and I'm chewing on a damn cigar, getting sick, sipping whiskey, which I never drank before in my life. And this guy turned out to be the FBI agent who was the class counselor for my uncle. So that night, over a bottle of whiskey and 2 cigars, he convinced me to file an application the next day at FBI headquarters to become an FBI agent. And that's how it all began. And it was an absolutely crazy bolt of lightning out of the sky. And it was the best move I ever made in my life. Now, in those days, the myth was you had to be either an accountant or a lawyer. And that's never really been the case. You can be an accountant, a lawyer, you can have a science background, you can have a language background, and you can have what they call executive experience. You could also have a strong science background. Those categories, as long as you were involved in something like that for a minimum of 3 years beyond college, then you could meet the minimum qualifications for an FBI agent. Well, I met them because I had 3 years of teaching, but I also met them because I had not only 3 years of teaching, but I had a science background. So I qualified through their science program or as an executive with 3 years of executive experience, which teaching was. Being a former military officer for 3 years would qualify you. So one of the great things about the FBI is the varied backgrounds of the people who qualify for the job. Bottom line is you had to be 25 years old and have 3 years of some executive experience beyond college. And I met that threshold. And believe it or not, 6 months later, I got a Western Union telegram delivered to my front porch at my house in Maine, a message from J. Edgar Hoover telling me I had 10 days to get to Washington, D.C. to attend new agents class.
Wow.
And that's how it all started.
What an incredible story. And so what kinds of things did you start doing as an FBI agent, and how did those, if they did at all, relate to ham radio, your hobby?
Well, I mean, that's where the story really gets interesting, because as a young agent, I attended the 3 months of training at Quantico. My first office of assignment was Minneapolis. So we went out to Minneapolis for a couple of years, and there I worked on bank robberies, kidnappings, theft from interstate shipments, the basic type of investigations that the FBI gets involved in. The number of the varied classifications that the FBI can investigate varies from cattle rustling to misuse of the Smokey the Bear emblem to bank robbery to espionage to theft of interstate motor vehicles and so forth. So there are over 200 different classifications that the FBI can actually investigate. So I investigated probably the run-of-the-mill basic, learn from the ground up, interstate transportation of stolen property, the bank robberies, and so forth. After 2 years, then I got transferred to Norfolk, Virginia. And I got transferred, they call you into a room and they ask you, where would you like to go? And I said, the important thing for me initially was I'd love to be near the ocean because I was born and raised near the ocean. Well, of course, they sent me to Minneapolis. But then after Minneapolis, somebody obviously was looking out for me because I got transferred to Norfolk and we got to move to Virginia Beach. And there I figured I'd be spending the rest of my career in a wonderful small town of Norfolk, Virginia, near Virginia Beach and Chesapeake, and just a great place to live. When I arrived in Norfolk, I was doing the same type of work, except with a number of military bases in the area. We had theft of government property, crimes on government reservations, bank robberies, kidnappings. But we also had some foreign counterintelligence matters because of the naval bases there and the interest on the part of the Soviet Union to know what was going on with the military. So I got to work a little bit of espionage cases as well. But what happened after about 3 years, the boss called me in and said, I want you to go to a special school up in Washington for administration. And I'm thinking maybe you should become an administrator in the Bureau at some point. And he put me in charge of applicant recruitment. So I said, okay, well, I'll give that a try. But you have to go to Washington to go to a special in-service training. So I packed my bags and I went up to Washington for a week of training. While I was there, I get called out of class. And some agent came up to me and he said, hey, the computer has spit your name out. We understand you know Morse code. I said, well, I do. I'm a ham radio operator. And he says, well, guess what? J. Edgar Hoover has selected you to be considered to fill a special job here in Washington, D.C., involving foreign counterintelligence, intercepting radio signals, decrypting messages, and catching spies.
Holy cow.
And he says, by the way, you have about 12 hours to call your wife and discuss it, and we need an answer. So here I am in Washington, D.C., in the middle of learning to become an applicant recruiter. And because I was a ham radio operator and I knew Morse code, that kicked my name out to be qualified to work in Washington, D.C. in what they considered or known as the engineering section. So I go back to Norfolk by Friday. In the meantime, I've called my wife and I said, it looks like they want to transfer me to Washington, D.C. I got back to my office Friday afternoon. The boss calls me in. He hands me a teletype saying I had 40 days to report to Washington, D.C. in my new assignment in the engineering section. I had no idea what the hell what was going to happen. So I ended up, and by the way, we had just bought a new house and had moved into it, and we'd only been in it about 3 months. So anyway, we ended up packing up, and I moved to Washington, and I became a part of the engineering section. This was a classified job description. There was virtually nothing really written up about it. And I was to head up basically what turned out to be the FBI's signal intelligence branch. The FBI is responsible for counterintelligence in the United States. And we work very closely with the National Security Agency and CIA. both of those agencies are not allowed by law to conduct any investigation or any work within the confines of the United States. The FBI really is the only agency that's allowed to do this. So I inherited a unit with a few employees, and that job was to intercept HF communications going to and from the United States to the Soviet Union, to the Eastern Bloc countries, and to Cuba. And there were many facilities in the United States that were using the HF bands, many embassies and missions and consulates that had the capability to use RTTY and transmit back to their home, to the motherlands, using log periodic antennas on the roof of their embassies. And it was my job to sit back and look at all of that and put on some big ears and to monitor all of that traffic that was going out and coming in. The traffic that we collected would then be taped, and it would be digitized, and it would be sent to the National Security Agency to be decoded. And I never saw the results of the product. We were there to collect and to provide the information. And that information would come back, whatever they were able to break out, whatever information they were able to glean from the intercepts that we were doing in the United States, it would come back to the intelligence community so filtered that nobody could tell where it came from. And so we never really got to see the results. That was one aspect of my job. But the other aspect of my job, which was like dying and going to heaven, as far as the ham radio operator was concerned, was I was to monitor all of the incoming traffic on the HF bands from the Soviet Union and Cuba that were coming in encoded messages to spies hidden in the United States. And some of those spies, of course, were double agents. So they were working for us. But on the other hand, there were so many signals coming in on the HF bands to people that were unknowns. And in those days, now I'm talking, HF communications was very active during World War II, the 50s and into the 60s and early 70s. And most of the embassies and many of the spies that we were investigating were using radio traffic, they had to learn Morse code to receive their messages from the Soviet Union or from the Eastern Bloc countries, or in some cases it was coming out of Cuba. NSA's responsibility, they are a giant vacuum cleaner looking at all of the radio waves all over the world. And so I would go out to NSA and meet with those people, and they would make available to me all of these messages that they were collecting from their facilities around the world, not in the United States. But by looking at the time of day, the frequencies, trying to find out what the maximum usable frequency would be, there was a pretty good effort and a study done to determine, of all of these broadcasts that were emanating out onto the HF bands, which ones were destined for North America, Central America, South America. And so we were very much involved in working with them on those programs. But as a shortwave listener, and later on as a ham radio operator, I go out and listen to what's out there on the HF bands. And most hams do that, certainly the shortwave listeners do. And you hear all of these weird signals coming from someplace. You'll hear groups of 5, you'll hear groups of letters, you'll hear groups of 5 letters and numbers mixed together. And they're coming from different places. And that's how these countries were communicating with not only their embassies, but also with their spies around the world. The German Grundig radio was always a tip-off because they were the ones recommended by the Russians for their spies to have in the United States to use to monitor their incoming messages. On average, the spies that we were dealing with would receive anywhere from 1 to 3 messages a week. And they would all come in groups of 5, either letters or letters and numbers. the GRU, which was the military version of the Soviet intelligence service, stuck strictly with numbers. The KGB was a little bit more sophisticated, and their messages would be mixed up between letters and numbers.
Jim,
Hey, go
So
ahead.
So that's
That would-
basically kind of what I was brought back to do.
okay. That would explain all the HF Yankees I've seen on top of buildings when I've been to DC. So,
Absolutely.
but what kind of radio equipment did you use?
I can't get into that in very much detail. Let me put it this way. My radios would monitor from 1 megahertz to 30 megahertz at one time. So it was like it's like the new SDR concept.
Mm.
But in those days, my equipment, which by the way was designed and presented to us by sister agencies, they had it budgeted. We didn't have to budget for the equipment. So most of my equipment came from other agencies, and it would be placed in strategic locations around the targets. Because when you have a radio that is that broad, you have to be relatively close to your target to hear it whenever they would transmit. One of the things that was kind of unique, and I learned early on, was that the Russians were very sensitive, and the Soviet bloc countries as well, were very sensitive about the frequencies that they would use on the HF bands. They knew that ham radio operators were very protective of their bands. And the last thing they wanted to do was to put up a clandestine broadcast in or anywhere near a ham band. So you could be pretty well sure that the messages that I was looking at and we were recording and ultimately deciphering, those were spread out all throughout the entire HF band, and sometimes mixed in with some of the multi-thousand kilowatt stations that were broadcasting, like Radio Budapest and Radio Moscow and others. So here I am sitting in Washington, D.C. with some of the greatest, most expensive, most exclusive radio equipment known to mankind, sitting there thinking I've died and gone to heaven. And at the same time, we're contributing to the safety of the United States by hopefully locating, identifying, and monitoring spies in this country.
Let's get on to that a little bit because, of course, you're listening to the sources of these communication, one-way communication, let's say from the former Soviet Union to the United States. And you know it's being directed at the United States. Maybe you know a little bit about what part of the U.S., given the band conditions, time of day, gray line, all that stuff. But how in the world would you locate a spy in the U.S. who is merely listening to these signals?
Well, we have a lot of suspects. And many of these people that we're dealing with, we had doubled. They were actually working for us. So we knew we had in advance. They had one-time pads so they could break their codes. We could break the codes because we had access to all the information that was being provided to them. But what's interesting is that we identified a few people that we suspected, but we noticed that over time, because we're surveilling them, physically surveilling them all over the United States, that they had to be home at a certain time during the day, so many days a week. And so we would go back and look at the logs that NSA would provide us, and we could match up when a broadcast was coming in and when they had to be home. And so a pattern would develop where we could match up an unknown broadcast coming into the United States with the comings and goings of a suspect that we had in mind. And then, of course, and using the court system and getting the appropriate warrants and so forth, we would then insert hidden microphones into their homes or wherever. So we would not only hear the broadcast coming in over the radio, but we could actually hear their radio and the same broadcast they were listening to. Even if they had headphones on, our microphones were sensitive enough to hear the sound of the dots and dashes leaking out the side of the headphones. So that was one technique that we could use.
Amazing. And what would happen if you got to the point where you thought maybe you could turn one of those spies around to be a double agent, let's say, on behalf of the U.S., or if you wanted to shut them down completely? Was that the FBI's job, or how did that go?
No, that was the FBI, that was the FBI's job. And of course, the ultimate goal would be to do just that, to make an approach to them, to lay out all the evidence that we had of what they were up to, and get them to turn. Many of them did. Several refused to. And we would then PNG them, persona non grata them, and then we could scoop them up. We could arrest them for espionage. There were several different things we could do, but often we would take them and exchange them for our spies that were in prison overseas. And there were a lot of exchanges that took place over the years that were never made public, where we were able to identify spies in this country. And if they didn't want to cooperate, then we had a lot of leverage. What's really fascinating is that, because the NSA was a highly classified, and still is, agency. In the course of their signal intelligence gathering around the world, they store all these messages. And their operators are really good to the extent that they can tell, even by the cadence of the Morse code that was being sent. Most of this code was not being sent by machines, it was being sent by operators. And you can identify hams sometimes by the way they send their Morse code. They could identify the intelligence officers sitting in Moscow or Budapest or somewhere in Czechoslovakia. They could identify them by their hand motions on the Morse code. Didn't know them by name, but they could tell by listening to them, that they've heard them before. And they can develop a program where they can predict when the next message is going to come up. And what was fascinating, one of the very first cases that I worked on was a fellow, and he was down in Texas, in a small country, little town in Texas. Most of the spy cases, by the way, did not occur in the big cities. Most of them were out around the country in smaller towns. And this was a small town in Texas. And what we were able to do, once we identified him, and then we put an electronic intercept into his house, we could monitor everything he was doing. And we were unable to break the code until we were able to put some photographic surveillance in his bedroom from the ceiling down, and watching him right on his desk how he broke his code down when the messages were coming in. Once it turned out he was using what they call a one sentence. He had memorized one sentence, and the letters in that sentence could then be translated and then turned over into numbers. And those numbers could then be turned back into letters, which would then give him his plain text message. It's a pretty complicated system. But once we identified him, NSA was able to give us every message that he had received for the previous 4 or 5 years when we didn't know what he was doing. So here we are from day one, we identified this guy, and now we can go back into the archives and pull every message that has been going to him and break them, because their tradecraft was not that good, in the sense that he never changed the way he broke down his messages. So we were able to go back and break every message for 4 or 5 previous years as to what they were telling him all that time. This is a guy who was in the United States. He had obtained a Ford Foundation grant to get a PhD. I'm not sure, I can't recall how he was actually recruited to work for the Soviets, but his job was, once a year, he was to travel to Florida and pick up a rock about the size of a football that was hollowed out and hidden in a park that contained information from another spy in Florida who would fill that rock with the information. And it would be sitting in the woods somewhere, and over the radio, he'd get directions on where it was located, and he'd go pick it up. He would drive all the way from Texas to Florida to get the rock, and then he would drive to Washington, D.C., and leave the rock in a park in Washington, D.C. for one of the Soviet spies that worked out of the embassy to come by the park. He had a way to signal electronically the people in the embassy that he was in town and his rock was in the woods in the park, and they would go and pick up the rock. And of course, we found out about this, and we were able to surveil and photograph. We identified who the spy was in Florida. We identified who the spy was in Washington who came to get the rock. So it has a mushrooming effect. So the case exponentially got bigger and bigger. And we had several cases like that during my time of working in that. So that was my ham radio experience that got me into that kind of work.
I've got one comment, and then we'll move on from there. But this is so fascinating. I have a friend who was in the military, the U.S. military, during Vietnam. And he was recruited for one purpose. And that purpose was to listen to CW being sent with hand keys. He was positioned in a country, I don't think I should say the name of the country, near Vietnam, where they had a few people working together there. And his sole job was to get to know the fist, the sound of the CW, the way it was done by one guy who was sending from North Vietnam, sending out messages. And so whenever that fist came on, he was in charge of it. And he got to the point where he could tell if the guy was excited or bored or just playing around or whatever by the way he was sending, even though he didn't know the language. Just amazing.
Well, I can take it one step further too, just to expand a little bit on what we're talking about. We had some spies, like we have ham radio operators, they're smart as hell, but they can't learn Morse code. And so we had a few who were unable to learn the Morse code. So the Russians came up with a system using Nixie tubes, and they would transmit tones to this guy via the HF, and those tones then would ignite the Nixie tube, and he had a radio with several Nixie tubes in it, and the numbers would pop up as to what the numbers were being sent via digital communication. So some of these were special radios that were given to them so they could read the Nixie tubes because they couldn't learn Morse code. We had others who couldn't learn Morse code, and they were told to they were given a whole series of instructions, detailed instructions, and they were to listen to Radio Moscow. And at 11 o'clock in the morning, if Moonlight Sonata came on, or if Beethoven's Fifth Symphony came on and played at a certain time, that told them they had to go do something. So they could equate the music that they were listening to on the shortwave bands to the instructions that they already had, and to give them the proper timing to go do the things they had to do without learning Morse code or deal with Nixie tubes.
Wow.
And by the way, that hasn't changed much today. You have some countries out there that don't have the capability, the technology, the funding to do some of the things that other countries can do. That said, that the internet and of course satellites have added a whole new dimension. So my job probably doesn't even exist anymore because the technology has gone way beyond it. When I was in the mid to late 70s, I was still doing this work. Several of our so-called double agents were given small transmitters to use, and they were used to talk to satellites that were passing overhead. There were several synchronous satellite systems that the Russians had up. And so all they had to do was to send their messages a couple of 100 miles up on VHF frequencies and talk to satellites. Mm-hmm. And so that negated the use of HF. But HF was, even every FBI office had an HF station as a backup. And they learned to do that back right after World War II. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, it was the FBI radio station in Honolulu transmitted an HF signal to Washington to say, hey guys, is there some kind of exercise going on that we need to know about? Or we're getting shelled like hell here. So the FBI actually had notified Washington of the Japanese invasion, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, using our HF radio stations in those days. We used that the old school was, let's keep HF RTTY vacuum tubes, because if a nuclear war, the vacuum tubes will survive when maybe transistors in solid state will be very vulnerable. So it wasn't until, I'm going to say, the late 70s, early 80s, did the FBI actually give up their daily communication with Washington via RTTY and HF bands.
Now, you also got involved with the CIA, correct?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, what happened as a result of my job in the Bureau, I was fairly successful at it and had been promoted up to and out of that job, which was a real tough decision for me, because I ended up hiring or transferring. We have several ham radio operators in the FBI, and I was able to transfer a couple of them from our field offices back into Washington to continue the liaison with CIA and NSA in my old assignment. And so that work continued, and I actually left that work like in 1977. So I was only into it for 4 or 5, maybe 6 years at the most. The other thing too was that because it was the early 70s, we had a very close relationship with GCHQ, or the equivalent of NSA in Great Britain and England. And so between Canada, England, Australia, and the United States, we stayed in very close contact with each other, sharing much of the information that I'm talking about. By the way, the things that I'm talking about today are no longer classified. There are books, there are publications, there are stories out there that, and it's 30, 40 years old. So we're talking about the good old days. But I did maintain a very close working relationship with GCHQ. And on my desk, I actually had an Enigma machine that was confiscated from the Germans during World War II, that was recovered off the shores of Long Island. And as a gift to me, I got to keep an original Enigma machine as a kind of a trophy on my desk. Couldn't take it anywhere, but I got a chance to show it off to people when they would come and visit and see it. But more importantly, because of our relationship with the Brits, I traveled to England frequently for meetings and got to work in the early 70s with the tail end of the careers of the British mathematicians and hams who were very instrumental in breaking the codes and creating HF networks for the spies operating between England and Germany during World War II. So I was absolutely thrilled to meet and to work with these guys who had been through the mill. They literally had been through the mill. And I got to see them during the last few years of their careers, which made it interesting. Several of those guys were ham radio operators as well. What was the question you were asking me?
Yeah, about the CIA.
Well, what happened was in 1977, there were some allegations made against the FBI about abuses of power by J. Edgar Hoover. Many of the allegations were sent to Congress and sent to the Attorney General at the time. Excuse me. Turn my cell phone off. The allegations were centered around the engineering section that I was a part of. In those days, the FBI had a cutout company in Washington, D.C., and every piece of electronic equipment that we purchased, we would purchase through this cutout. So the FBI was never known what kind of tape recorders, what kind of transmitters, what kind of burglar alarm systems we would purchase. All of the electronic devices that we purchased were purchased through a cutout, and who happened to be a friend of J. Edgar Hoover. And what's interesting about this is we did not want the public or anybody to know what kind of equipment we were using. So we would pay this company to make all these purchases. And as a result, these were sole source contracts. And they were highly specific contracts involving much of the electronic gear that we were using. But it protected the Bureau from people on the outside knowing what we were using. Well, what happened? Other vendors got upset that they were not able to compete and to sell us electronic equipment because everything had to go through this recording company, as it was, in Washington, D.C. So there were all kinds of allegations made that this company was getting tremendous profits and there was kickbacks and all of this stuff. Well, because it was a highly technical allegations, because I was in the engineering section with my background, and I knew exactly what the engineering section was purchasing for equipment throughout the whole FBI, I was selected like one of 9 agents to go to work on a special investigation with an independent counselor, with an attorney brought in, just like you hear today. And we were to investigate the FBI and whether or not there was corruption in the purchase and sale of all this equipment. That investigation lasted about 18 months, and it was fairly significant. And what we found out was that the owner of this recording company was really a decent man. And if we looked at the average markup of the millions of dollars of equipment that were being purchased, the average markup was 10%, which was way below the norm. But the bottom line, again, was the FBI was not found to be in violation of any criminality. However, they were violating a few rules and regulations, government procurement rules and regulations. And the one thing that caused the biggest stir was that the FBI in those days, by the way, I'll tell you, we were totally non-political. I didn't know anybody I didn't even know if the director was Republican or Democrat. It just was unheard of. But what happened was the FBI would have to go to the Department of Justice if they had to make any electronic purchase that cost more than $5,000. Well, $5,000 in the 50s and 60s was a lot of money. But in reality, when you have a national agency like the FBI, $5,000 is a drop in the bucket, especially if there's a major case going on. But to have to write a memo and then go to the Department of Justice and then have them approve it before you could make the purchase was just a bridge too high for anybody to want to cross. So the FBI came up with a process and said, all of our invoices are going to be for $4,999.99. And if we need equipment that costs $10,000, we're going to submit 2 vouchers or 2 invoices for $4,999.99. And they did that for millions of dollars worth of invoices to avoid having to go to the Department of Justice to get approval. So that was kind of a technical violation of the rules. So that was one of our big findings, was we had to go back and rewrite and readdress the way the Bureau should procure its equipment and so forth. But because of the nature of the investigation, and here we were investigating abuse of power of J. Edgar Hoover, the 9 agents that were selected, we were kind of risking our careers because we were out interviewing senior FBI people about what was going on, going back to the 40s and 50s to try to backtrack and to make some sense out of what all these allegations were about. And we found along the way that there were 2 or 3 employees that were involved in some stuff that they shouldn't have been involved in, and that was dealt with separately. But in the meantime, our profile of these 9 agents was pretty high. And as a result, I got several promotions. And I got promoted much faster than the average agent because at the same time, we had new pension rules coming in. And at that time, you could stay until you was 65, 70 years of age. The new rule came in, you had to retire at 57. And that meant we had hundreds of senior agents scattered around the country, of which the Bureau in those days, it only had 10,000 agents in the whole world. So as a government agency, you have only 10,000 agents, maybe 12,000 support employees. So there's only like 20 or 25,000 people in the whole whole agency. Today it's only like 35,000, so it hasn't grown that much. But the bottom line was that here I was, a young agent with a highly specialized background, had been successful in some high profile matters within the Bureau. Obviously, I guess had demonstrated some management potential. So I started getting these promotions because, not because I was that good, but because everybody else was retiring because they had to. The mandatory retirement, which is still true today, is 57. And we probably had 3,000 or 4,000 that had to leave within the next year or two. Only a few were grandfathered. So as a result, I got promoted very quickly up to I became the director in charge of the FBI laboratory. And in that role, I was only 38 years old. And I knew enough about science to get myself in trouble. And I had probably, I think there were probably like 2,500 people working in the FBI laboratory, some really great scientists. So I was there as a manager dealing with the budgets and personnel and policy issues. I did not have hands-on dealing with evidence. And I kind of got a little flustered with that job. And I went to see the director one day and I said, look, I said, I never really joined the FBI. I know I have a science background. I know that's partly why I was selected for the job, but I really would like an opportunity to get back to the field and do casework. And so at the time, there was an opening in Washington for an inspector general position to be the director in charge of the inspection division. So he said, well, I'll get you out of the lab and I'm going to put you in charge of the inspection division. So that was like in charge of the white glove inspections that took place in all of our 56 field offices around the country. So here I am as this young Turk in his late 30s, now in charge of inspections of field office and inspecting people who were much senior to me, much more knowledgeable, more experienced than me. And it was a good job. I stayed in it for about a year and a half, 2 years. And finally, I went back to the director and I said, director, I really want to get back to the field. I really want to get back into casework. So he let me step down and I was able to go to Boston to be the agent in charge of the FBI office in Boston. And that was during the Whitey Bulger era and all of the issues that we were dealing with back then. And I was there from 1982 to 1986. And by 1986, there were a lot of changes going on in the FBI. And the director called me one day and he said, you've had enough time in the field. I want you to come back to be the director of the FBI Academy. So I left being the agent in charge of the Boston office, and I went to Quantico, Virginia, to be the director of the FBI Academy. And so I got down there, and I was there for a couple of years, and then the director had completed his 10-year term as director, and President Bush asked him to take over the CIA and to become the director of the CIA. So Judge Webster, his name was Bill Webster. So Bill Webster completed his tour in the FBI, and he goes ahead and he transfers over to become a head of the CIA. Well, I'm down in Quantico, figuring this is going to be this is one of the best jobs in the Bureau, to be the director of the Academy. I was having a ball. I set up a complete S-line series on a radio station in the FBI Academy for all of the FBI students that came through who were ham radio operators, both state, local police, as well as FBI agents. We had our own radio station right there. K3 FBI was broadcasting for a lot of the students while I was there. I don't know what happened to it after I left, because 2 years later, I get a call from the director and he says, I want you to resign from the FBI. I want you to come over to CIA. And so he had been so good to me, I couldn't say no. So bottom line was, I had to resign from the Bureau and I went to work at CIA headquarters in Washington, D.C. And my official title when I got there was Director of Public Affairs. And basically, I was in charge of being responsible for dealing with the national and then international news media, campus recruitment around the United States, the speechwriters, anything having to do with the history and the media, I was responsible for. That was my overt job. I did have a covert responsibility dealing with defectors and spies and helping them to relocate properly in the United States. Um, and based on my experiences of trying to catch these guys, now I got to meet them when they decided to defect, or we had recruited them to come to the States to work for us. So I had made full circle as far as counterintelligence work was concerned, and had some wonderful experiences with some of the spies and helping to get them settled and relocated here in the United States. But even then, I felt like a fish out of water. And one day I get a call from Janet Reno, and she said, "We would like you to come back." She was the Attorney General at the time. And she said, "We'd like for you to come back to the FBI as the #3 guy in charge of administration. You'll be in charge of personnel, the budget, and policy for the FBI." So again, you can't say no to something like that. So I went back to the FBI, and that was around 1990, 91, and worked there under the new director, Bill Sessions. And while I was there, I had a couple of really good years, but he and I had some differences of opinion. And again, I have to reiterate, there was never any politics. I worked at the senior levels in the FBI for several years. I never knew if the director was a Republican or Democrat. I don't ever recall a political discussion. It was always about what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. And that goes back to the days when J. Edgar Hoover was alive, because I worked for him for 5 years, all the way through Clarence Kelly, Bill Webster, Bill Sessions, and Louis Freeh came in as director. Bob Mueller was a personal friend of mine. I had worked with him when he was working as an assistant U.S. attorney in Boston. So I knew Bob Mueller, who became director of the FBI. Not a political word did I ever hear any of those guys ever offer during my times working with them. But I got back to the Bureau. I was involved in managing the FBI budget, the personnel practices. It was a wonderful job. I was still relatively young, but I had some differences of opinion with Bill Sessions, the director, and I finally asked him if I could step down from that job and go back to the field. Every time I asked for a favor in the FBI, I was asking for a demotion to get back to the field. And the bottom line was, because we were still friends, but we had some very substantive differences of opinion about the way the FBI was doing and some of the things he was doing, which he later was fired for by President Clinton. He let me step down, and I went to London to head up our Western European operations. And I moved to London, England around 92, and I stayed there until July of 94. Wow. And I covered England, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland. Got to meet ham radio operators over there that I had talked to on the HF bands over the years. But that ended up being my career in the FBI just because I knew CW.
It's amazing. What a story. And you said you've lived in 38 different homes. Is that right?
Yes.
Wow.
Some of those were self-inflicted. I'd move into an area like in Virginia. We moved to Norfolk, and I said, "Oh, this is a wonderful place. We're going to spend the rest of our careers here." So we decided to upgrade it to another home. So we moved to Virginia Beach, and near the beach. But then things got a little crowded. We'd been there. We built a new house in Chesapeake. Well, 2 months after we moved into the new house in Chesapeake is when they transferred my butt back to Washington. So thanks to the Bureau's career development process and having to be transferred every time you get promoted, and I got transferred a lot, I ended up with 39 different houses up until the day I retired. The house I'm in right now is my 39th house.
Wow.
And I've had a ham station in every one of them.
Every one of them. Jim, you are a kind of national treasure. And the most amazing part of this story, which I remember you telling me, got me interested in you, was it was because of CW. And knowing the Morse code got this going with such an incredible life that you have had, wonderful service to this country. And you're obviously a humble person. a genuine patriot.
Well,
And
I was born on the day war was declared, on
Mm.
December 8th, 1941. And I'll be 85 years old on my next birthday. And I've had a ham radio license since I was 14 years of age.
great, great. Thanks so much for doing this video with us. I'm sure we'll have a lot of great comments on it, and I'll keep you posted. Okay, Jim?
Thank you for having me. And all I can say is the FBI is a very honorable agency and doing a hell of a job for us.
Yeah, we believe that too. Thanks so much. This is
My
Quin.
pleasure.
This is Quin, K8QS.
I'm Tom, WA9TDD.
73 from all three of us.
73.